The camera caught him in profile, Arnold, older now, his hands folded, eyes fixed on a screen behind him replaying the worst moments of his career. The crowd laughed on cue, but something in the room felt wrong, like a celebration turning into a slow betrayal. He didn't interrupt, he simply waited. What happens when the strongest man in the room refuses to defend himself and still wins? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Under the blinding studio lights of late-night television, the audience cheered on cue as the curtain lifted to reveal Jimmy Kimmel, all grins and sharp edges. The usual rhythm followed, banter, punchlines, the pulse of a crowd trained to laugh. Then, with a rehearsed pause, he turned toward the guest chair. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Arnold Schwarzenegger." The applause swelled. Arnold entered calmly, a simple dark blazer over an open-collar shirt, walking with the unhurried gait of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. His presence carried a quiet gravity, not the boisterous bodybuilder of the 80s, nor the campaigner shaking hands in a sea of cameras. Just a man in his 70s, eyes soft, smile modest, nodding graciously to the crowd. He shook Kimmel's hand and took his seat. There was warmth in his expression, the same warmth that once made even his fiercest critics admire him, but something in Kimmel's demeanor was off. A twitch in the jaw, a flicker behind the cue card. The host leaned forward. "You know, Arnold," he began, voice laced with mischief, "we've prepared something special for you tonight." A chuckle from the crowd. Arnold blinked, still smiling, but a subtle shift in his shoulders betrayed a quiet instinct, one forged through decades of interviews, negotiations, and ambushes. He said nothing. The screen behind them buzzed to life. A montage began to play. Batman and Robin, the infamous ice puns, groan-inducing clips from lesser-known films, scenes with bad dubbing, flat lines, over-the-top action. Even grainy footage from early interviews where his accent was heavy and his English uncertain. One clip showed a talk show host mocking his pronunciation of California. Laughter broke out, polite at first, then louder. Kimmel turned to him, grinning. "Some real classics, huh?" Arnold didn't flinch. He watched the screen without blinking, like someone revisiting old photographs not for nostalgia, but recognition. The kind of recognition only time could teach. He didn't interrupt. He let it run. The final image froze mid-laugh, a shot of Arnold from decades ago, shirtless in a ridiculous costume, yelling into the void. The crowd tittered. Kimmel raised his eyebrows and delivered the line with theatrical delight. "I mean, nice to meet you." Even some audience members groaned at the forced punchline, but Arnold just smiled softly. Not the smile of someone amused, but someone who had already heard every joke, every jab, every recycled insult. The same smile worn by men who had learned how to survive ridicule and remain standing. The room teetered between amusement and discomfort. Kimmel pushed forward, voice quickening. "Come on, Arnold, that was gold. You've got to admit, some of those choices were questionable." Arnold looked at him gently, almost like a teacher regarding an overeager student. "Yes," he said simply. The accent, though still present, was measured, smooth. Some of them were very bad. A few audience members chuckled nervously. He turned slightly, looking out, not at Kimmel, not at the screen, but somewhere further, as if addressing someone far beyond the walls of the studio. "But bad choices are still choices, and every one of them taught me something. Even that one," he added, nodding toward the frozen frame of his younger, costumed self. Kimmel shifted in his seat, slightly caught off guard by the lack of defensiveness. The silence grew. From the second row, a woman in her 60s leaned toward her husband. "That's not the Arnold I remember," she whispered. "No," he replied, eyes locked on the stage. "That's the real one." Arnold folded his hands in his lap. "You know, Jimmy," he said, not unkindly, "the thing about being humiliated on television is that it only works if you still care about being perfect." The line didn't land like a joke. It wasn't meant to, but it lingered. A slow chord building under the surface. The camera stayed on his face. No makeup could hide the lines of time, the quiet weight of lived experience. And behind him, the screen faded to black. The show moved on, but the tone had shifted, subtly, irrevocably. And somewhere in the control booth, a producer sat frozen, realizing the night would not go as planned. The segment should have moved on. That's how these shows were designed: keep the pace, chase the laughs, pivot before the weight settles. But Kimmel hesitated. Something about Arnold's calm refusal to bite had thrown off the rhythm, and rather than back away, he doubled down. "Well," he said, forcing a grin, "we haven't even gotten to the real gems yet." The screen behind them lit up again. Clips from Arnold's campaign trail as governor of California now filled the frame: awkward sound bites, political gaffes, moments when he struggled with policy under media scrutiny. One video zoomed in on a moment from a 2005 press conference. A reporter asked about a controversial education bill. Arnold paused mid-answer, visibly frustrated, then walked off stage without finishing. "Not exactly the Terminator in that one, huh?" Kimmel quipped. A few polite chuckles fluttered through the audience, but most sat still. There was a new edge now, not playful teasing, but something colder. The contrast between the glowing stage and the uneasy tension in the room became palpable. The applause signs flickered again, but only half-hearted claps followed. Arnold didn't look at the screen anymore. He looked at Jimmy. Kimmel picked up a cue card. "And then there's this beauty. Remember when the LA Times called you an actor lost in Sacramento?" He read the quote aloud, stretching each word like a punchline. "A body built to conquer, but a voice unsure of where to lead. That's poetic." Still no reaction from Arnold, no shift in posture, no tightness around the jaw, just listening. Kimmel tried again. "What were you thinking taking on politics, man? You had it all: fame, movies, fans. Why step into something you clearly weren't trained for?" This time, the question didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like judgment. Arnold finally blinked, slowly. "I was thinking," he said, voice even, "that maybe someone needed to." The audience stilled. There was no music, no drum roll to rescue the moment. Arnold turned his palms upward, resting them on his knees. "I was thinking that I grew up in a country where we were told not to speak up, where the government was something to fear, not something to fix. I came here because this country offered freedom. So when California was struggling, I didn't want to sit back and criticize from the sidelines. I stepped in." Kimmel opened his mouth, but Arnold gently raised a hand, not to silence, but to finish. "I wasn't trained for politics. I wasn't trained for English either, or acting, or surviving poverty, or losing my brother in a car crash when I was 20, but I still showed up. That's what I was thinking." The audience didn't move. A few leaned forward, elbows on knees, caught in something deeper than spectacle. Kimmel glanced at the screen, now frozen on a headline from 2007. Governor Schwarzenegger's approval ratings hit record low. He cleared his throat. "Well, that's quite a speech." Arnold smiled softly. "It's not a speech, it's just the truth." The lighting hadn't changed, but the mood had. Kimmel, who once mastered the art of timing, seemed adrift. He reached for another card, found it empty, then set it aside. Someone in the back coughed. Arnold looked out across the studio, his gaze moving slowly over the crowd. "You know, I've made a lot of mistakes," he said. "Some movies I should have passed on, some policies I could have handled better, but I never made a choice to humiliate someone else for entertainment." He didn't raise his voice, he didn't accuse, but the words landed like a gavel. "I've stood in front of crowds my whole life, sometimes shirtless, sometimes in a suit. I've been called a monster, a machine, a joke, but I've also been called a mentor, a protector, a father. What people forget is that it's all the same person." Kimmel looked down at his desk. For once, there was no clever line waiting, no pivot. Arnold let the silence speak, and in that silence something shifted, not just in the air, but in the eyes of those watching. The man they came to laugh at had quietly taken control, not by force, not by fury, but by refusing to play the game. Behind him, the screen dimmed to black. For a moment, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Jimmy Kimmel leaned back, fingers tapping his cue cards like he might find the right tone hiding between lines. But Arnold didn't move. He sat still, anchored, not defensive, not smug, just present. The studio lights, so often used to stage illusions, now revealed something raw and unpolished. The crowd sensed it too. No one reached for their phones. No one laughed. They were waiting. Kimmel tried to regroup. Okay, he said, his voice lighter, grasping at levity. Let's shift gears a bit. Maybe this'll cheer you up. With a quick gesture to the production team, another clip rolled. It was a compilation, this time, an almost mocking highlight reel of Arnold's most awkward moments. Scenes where he flubbed his lines. A commercial for a Japanese energy drink where he shouted wildly at the camera. A behind-the-scenes blooper where he mispronounced metaphor 4 times before giving up. Another clip showed him at a public event where the teleprompter had frozen and he stood silent, visibly uncomfortable. As the clips played, a few reluctant laughs bubbled up from the audience, but they didn't last. Somewhere between the second and third clip, discomfort returned. This wasn't nostalgia, it was exposure. The reel ended with a still image. Arnold from the early 90s, in a glittery silver costume from an ill-fated sci-fi film. The freeze frame caught him mid-sentence, mid-squint, looking oddly vulnerable. Kimmel smirked, leaning in. I mean, come on. You have to admit that one's hard to defend. What were you thinking? Arnold chuckled, genuinely this time. The accent was terrible, he admitted, eyes wrinkling with a flash of humor. I sounded like a robot trying to do Shakespeare. The audience laughed softly, unsure whether it was safe to relax again. Arnold's tone changed. You know, Jimmy, that role was shot in 1994. I was going through a lot that year. He paused, not for drama, just to let the truth settle. My younger brother Maynard had died not long before. A car accident, drunk driving, he was 34. A hush fell again. Even the camera operators, typically hidden in their routines, slowed their movements. I was halfway through filming when I got the call. I finished the movie, but I wasn't really there. I was flying back and forth to Austria for the funeral, helping my mother deal with the house, the papers, the silence. He glanced toward the monitor, still showing the ridiculous costume. His voice stayed steady. That's the thing about failure. Most people only see the outside of it, the box office numbers, the reviews. But sometimes, you take a role not because it's great, but because you're trying to stay standing. Kimmel blinked, his face frozen between reaction and retreat. Arnold leaned back, not as a tactic, but like someone remembering the shape of something that no longer hurt, but never quite left. I've taken jobs to pay for hospital bills, he continued, to support friends going through divorces, to keep production companies from going under, to make sure the crew had another 2 weeks of work. He turned, looking out at the audience. You do a lot of things over a long life. Some of them are smart, some of them are generous, and some are just survival. For the first time, someone in the audience nodded slowly, visibly moved. Kimmel tried to interject, his voice softer now. But wouldn't you agree, I mean, some of those choices? Arnold raised a hand gently. They were bad choices, he agreed. Artistically, commercially, yes. But I've never been embarrassed by effort, even if it fails. A beat passed, then another. I've failed more times than I can count, he said, in auditions, in politics, in business, but I've also stood back up more times than I've fallen. There was no crescendo, no orchestral swell, just silence, but in that silence, a quiet kind of awe emerged. Arnold looked again at the frozen image on the screen. That man, he said, didn't know what was coming, but he showed up. And that still matters to me. Kimmel lowered his cue cards. He wasn't smiling anymore, not because he was upset, but because he had begun to listen. The audience, once primed for comedy, now sat wrapped in something entirely unexpected. Respect, and behind the cameras, a production assistant glanced at the rundown for the segment, then quietly set it aside. The show, it seemed, was writing itself now. The studio sat on the edge of stillness. Kimmel adjusted his tie, shifting in his chair, not out of discomfort, but calculation. He had underestimated something. The crowd wasn't responding to spectacle. They were leaning into something slower, heavier. But still, a flicker of his usual impulse returned. He tried one last pivot. Well, illness didn't cause you to sign on for collateral damage, right? He said, tone casual but edged. I mean that one didn't exactly terminate at the box office. Another clip rolled on the screen. Arnold running from an explosion, yelling over a poorly mixed audio track, the flames too bright, the acting too flat. The Rotten Tomatoes score appeared beside it, 18%. The headlines read, Schwarzenegger's career implodes in B-movie meltdown.
The crowd didn't laugh, not even awkwardly. A woman in the third row looked down at her lap. A young man near the exit crossed his arms, visibly uncomfortable. Arnold watched the screen. This time something in his face changed, not anger, not injury, but intensity. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward. "You know, Jimmy," he said slowly, "I've been thinking about moments like these a lot." Kimmel blinked. Moments like... Moments where we choose what to highlight, what we call failure, what we replay for laughs. Arnold's voice was still even, but it carried now a quiet force beneath each word. "I've spent the last 2 years working on a project about this exact thing. Not movies, not politics, but the energy we put into the world." Kimmel raised an eyebrow. "Energy." "Yes," Arnold folded his hands. "What we reward. What we mock, what we ignore." The audience stayed frozen. "I used to think strength was only muscle, action, volume, but I've come to see it's restraint. It's staying present when someone tries to reduce your life to a punchline." Kimmel opened his mouth again, but Arnold spoke over him, without force, just certainty. "You call collateral damage a failure. Maybe it was. But the money from that film helped me quietly fund a therapy center for veterans in Northern California. No press release. Just a promise I made to a man I served beside in 1970, who later couldn't sleep through the night." The crowd didn't react, not because they were unimpressed, but because they didn't know how to move. Arnold continued, "And you know Red Sonja, another punchline, right?" He smiled faintly. "That was my first film after my father died. I took it because I needed to work. I needed motion, not stillness. Even if it was bad art, it was real pain underneath." Kimmel sat back, eyes wide now. "These moments you're showing," Arnold said, gesturing gently toward the dark screen, "they're not highlights. They're bookmarks, markers of survival. Some were artistic risks, some were debts owed, some were favors, and yes, some were just mistakes." He paused, but every one of them was honest. Silence again. Then a ripple quiet nods among the audience, not claps, not cheers. Just recognition. "You came in here," Arnold said, now looking directly at Kimmel, "trying to tell a story about how I fell. But I've fallen 1,000 times and I've gotten up 1,001. What you don't understand is, there's no shame in standing back up." Kimmel stared at him, cue cards limp in his hand. I didn't mean to." Arnold raised a hand, stopping him gently. "I know, you meant to entertain, that's the job. I've done it too, but what we laugh at becomes what we teach, and what we mock we normalize." His voice softened. "And I just think maybe it's time we normalize something else." The studio didn't move. Even the band stayed quiet. Then slowly someone in the second row began to clap. Not loudly, not performatively, just once. Then again. Another followed, then another. The applause grew, not explosive but genuine. A rising sound of people realizing they had witnessed not a performance but a lesson. Arnold sat still, letting it happen. And Jimmy Kimmel, for the first time in a long time, had nothing clever to say. The applause had faded into silence. Not the silence of tension, but something closer to reverence. A kind of collective stillness, as if everyone in the studio had finally realized this wasn't the usual game. This wasn't spectacle. Arnold reached into his inside jacket pocket. The motion was unhurried, almost absent-minded, but it carried weight, as if his very body understood the timing better than the room did. When he drew his hand back out, he was holding something small and worn, a folded sheet of paper creased at the edges, soft from years of handling. "I want to show you something," he said, turning slightly toward the audience. Not just the cameras, not just Kimmel, but the people who had stopped blinking. "This is a letter I've kept for 31 years. He held it in both hands, not reading yet, just holding. "It came in the summer of 1992. The envelope had no return address. It had traveled all the way from a refugee camp outside of Lviv, Ukraine. Handwritten, broken English. A pause. I was shooting Last Action Hero at the time. The press was calling it a disaster even before it came out. The studio was nervous. The director was stressed. I was being told the movie would ruin what was left of my career. He unfolded the letter slowly like a ritual. I was tired. I was angry. I was doubting whether any of it meant anything anymore. The audience waited, not because they were told to, but because something sacred was happening. I still remember the first sentence, Arnold said, glancing at the yellowed paper. Dear Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger, my name is Oleg. I am 13 years old. I have no father, but I watch your films and I believe maybe I could be strong too. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. Arnold didn't lift his eyes from the page. I do not speak English good, but I see in your eyes that you came from a place like ours. I want to be like you, not the muscles, the courage. He folded the letter again, slower this time. I don't know what happened to Oleg. I never found him. I wrote back, but the camp had closed. The mail came back undeliverable, but I kept the letter. He held it in the light, letting it catch the studio glow. Because every time I felt like quitting, every time someone told me I was a joke, or a has-been, or a dumb actor with a funny voice, I remembered this. He turned back to Kimmel now, softly. You wanted to show clips of me looking foolish. But what you didn't know was, somewhere in the world, a boy watched those same clips and saw a father figure, a protector, not because they were good, but because I showed up. Kimmel sat frozen. His face had lost all trace of performative charm. He wasn't playing host anymore. He was just a man being told the truth. Arnold laid the letter on the table between them. It looked out of place there, too fragile, too honest for the polished desk and the studio gloss. I've made a lot of movies, he said. Some of them brilliant, some of them terrible. But I don't measure them by box office or reviews anymore. He nodded toward the letter. I measure them by whether they reach someone like him. A woman in the third row wiped her eyes with a tissue. A man next to her placed a hand gently on her arm. Arnold looked toward the camera, not to perform, but to connect. There are people watching this tonight who have been told they're worthless, that they've failed too many times, that their accent is too thick, or their age is too high, or their past is too heavy. He paused, not for effect, for breath. To them I say, there is someone out there watching you too, and they don't care if you got it perfect. They just care that you kept going. The applause came slowly, one person then another like rain hitting a roof. Kimmel leaned forward, voice quiet. Arnold, I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Arnold said, the softness never leaving his voice. Just think about what kind of story you want to be part of. We all get to choose. And then he smiled, small, tired, sincere. Not the grin of a performer, but the peace of a man who no longer feared being misunderstood. The studio lights held steady. No cue cards moved. For the first time all evening, the show stopped being a show. It became something real. The studio was no longer a studio. It had become something else, something quieter, heavier. A cathedral of stillness where every breath felt shared. The air had shifted from expectation to reflection. And in the middle of it all, Arnold sat unmoved, not by stubbornness but by presence. Kimmel glanced toward his producers offstage. They didn't signal back. No rescue, no reset, just silence. The host cleared his throat, attempting to find footing. Well, we've got more clips if. Arnold turned his head, not fast, just enough. You know what truly embarrasses me, Jimmy? He said, voice soft but unwavering. Kimmel paused, not sure if it was a setup or a confession. Arnold leaned in slightly. Not a costume, not a flop, not a bad line reading. He let the moment breathe. What embarrasses me is using someone's past to entertain strangers. Reducing a life into a laugh track. The words landed without volume, and yet the weight of them pulled the entire room inward. Behind Arnold, the massive screen, which had once beamed ridicule, faded to black. Kimmel opened his mouth, then closed it. "We were just trying to have some fun," he offered, but it came out flat, brittle. "Were we?" Arnold asked, not accusing, just curious. "Because I've been on this show before. We've laughed. We've shared stories. But this felt different." He gestured vaguely to the empty screen. "And maybe that's not just about you. Maybe it's the system, the pressure to go viral, to provoke, to break someone down so the audience feels built up." The audience, still silent, slowly began to nod. It was no longer a performance for them. It was a mirror. "I get it," Arnold said, relaxing into the chair. "I've been part of that machine too. I've made action films that glorified violence. I've said things I regret. I've used my strength the wrong way." Kimmel looked down at his hands. "But tonight reminded me of something I read years ago. From Viktor Frankl." A few heads lifted at the name. "He said between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose, our freedom." Arnold looked up, not at Kimmel now, but at the audience. "At the world beyond the lens. You chose to play those clips, and I chose not to respond with anger. I chose to stand still." A beat passed, then another. "Because the truth is, you can humiliate a body but not a soul." Kimmel's voice cracked slightly. "I didn't mean to humiliate you, Arnold." Arnold smiled faintly. "I know, you meant to entertain, but that's the trap, when we start confusing harm for humor." He reached again toward the folded letter on the desk, the one from Oleg. He didn't open it this time, just touched it gently, as if reaffirming its truth. "I've learned that the loudest thing you can do is sometimes to say nothing at all." Now Kimmel nodded. "I wanted this to go viral," he admitted. "I wanted the numbers, the buzz, the headlines." Arnold looked at him gently. "And maybe it will, but not for the reasons you planned." The audience finally exhaled. A slow release, like coming up for air after something holy. Kimmel sat up straighter, his face clearer now, not of makeup, but of motive. "You changed the story tonight, Arnold." "No," Arnold said. "I just refused to play a role I never auditioned for." The crowd didn't cheer, they stood. One by one, then row by row, not as fans, not as an audience, but as witnesses. And in the quiet before the next segment cue, something irreversible had already happened. A week later, the lights of the same studio flickered on again. The band played a softer theme than usual, no fanfare, no mock intensity. The audience was already seated before the cameras rolled, quieter than they'd ever been. Arnold was back, but this time there was no pretense, no special clip package, no traps disguised as talk show banter, just two chairs, two people, and a conversation waiting to be finished. Jimmy Kimmel welcomed him with an outstretched hand and no jokes, no cue cards, just the weight of a moment still echoing from the week before. "I've been thinking about what you said," Kimmel said, his voice steady but humbled. "A lot of people have." Arnold nodded politely, the kind of gesture that carried more acceptance than words. "You changed something here," Kimmel continued. "Not just that night, but maybe what this place is supposed to be." Arnold looked at him kindly. "I didn't change anything, Jimmy. I just said no to something that didn't feel right." Kimmel paused, but that no started a wave. He wasn't exaggerating. Since the last show aired, clips had gone viral, not the embarrassing ones Kimmel's producers had planned, but the quiet ones. The ones where Arnold sat still, listened, spoke slowly, and refused to be drawn into humiliation. Viewers from around the world had flooded the network's inbox. Veterans, teachers, immigrants, people who said they had seen themselves in that silence, who said they were tired of watching people torn down for sport. One letter had come from a former talk show host who wrote simply, "He reminded us what dignity looks like." Kimmel gestured to the audience. "People keep asking if we're going to change the show. And I think the answer is, we already did." Arnold smiled faintly. "Change happens quietly, like water under rock. At first it looks like nothing, but give it time and it reshapes everything." There it was again, that calm, that presence, that refusal to dramatize what was already deeply human. "And your documentary?" Kimmel asked. Arnold leaned forward slightly. "It's being picked up, globally, But more important than the deal is the conversation it sparked. He paused, then added, I didn't expect a talk show segment to become part of the documentary, but now it is. Because this is the exact moment the film was made for. What's it called again? Kimmel asked. Arnold looked out toward the audience, then the camera, as if offering it not just to them, but to everyone who had ever felt small under scrutiny. The art of presence. The applause rose, not loud but full. The kind of applause that didn't beg for energy but gave it freely. Kimmel took a breath, visibly moved. There's something you said last week that I haven't been able to forget. Arnold tilted his head. You said you can humiliate a body but not a soul. Arnold didn't respond. He didn't need to. Kimmel continued. That line, it's why we're creating a new segment on this show. It's called Second Chances. We'll bring back people we've misjudged, people the media has thrown away too quickly, and we'll give them space, not to perform, just to be heard. Arnold nodded once firmly. That's the most powerful thing you can offer someone. The show cut to commercial moments later, but the applause didn't stop. Even when the red light flicked off, even when the cameras cooled, people didn't just clap for Arnold. They clapped for a door that had quietly opened, for a show that had chosen a different ending, for a man who didn't raise his voice, didn't pound his chest, didn't fight fire with fire. He just sat still and changed the room.